Hello again, and settle in for a little while. Tonight, I want to take you to Harlem, not as a headline, and not as a lesson delivered too quickly, but as a neighborhood at night, when the windows hold their own small constellations, and music can drift out into the street as softly as breath. It is the Harlem of polished shoes and tired hands, of boarding houses and brownstones, of long ambition carried north by train, of paper programs folded into coat pockets after a dance, of voices on stoops and distant brass turning darkness into something warm enough to step inside. If this kind of quiet history has a way of finding you after midnight, then you are in exactly the right place. Before the trouble arrived in the form we now recognize, Harlem could feel like the center of a new arrangement of American life. People had come there with hope packed tightly beside memory. Some had left the rural South with grief still fresh in the family. Some had come with almost no luggage at all, but with names, recipes, hymns, church hats, a few books, a few stories, and the stubborn private conviction that somewhere beyond the old boundaries, a life might widen. And in Harlem, for a while, it seemed possible. There were nights when the neighborhood felt as though it was creating itself in real time. A poet could be revising a line in one room while, 2 blocks away, a trumpet leaned into a phrase that would not survive the evening, except in the memory of whoever had heard it. A dancer might step into a ballroom under colored light and leave with sore feet, an empty purse, and a feeling that for 3 minutes the whole century had tilted toward joy. A seamstress might work all day in somebody else's building, and then spend an hour at her own window listening to the hum below, hearing in it some proof that she had not come north for nothing. This is worth lingering over because history can become too neat if we only remember what was lost and forget what was genuinely there before the loss. Harlem was not simply an idea of brilliance painted backward by later nostalgia. It was vivid in the ordinary way that neighborhoods become vivid when enough people are working, cooking, laughing, renting, praying, rehearsing, hurrying and imagining in close proximity. The life of the place was not contained in a few famous clubs. It lived in hallways, in after-church conversations, in kitchen tables with oilcloth covers, in the stoop where somebody sang half a chorus while somebody else corrected the notes, in the quiet pride of seeing children better dressed than their parents had been at the same age. And yet, even in bright places, strain gathers quietly. The glow that outsiders noticed first could make the deeper pressure harder to see. Harlem did not become vulnerable because it lacked intelligence or beauty or discipline. It became vulnerable because those things were asked to do too much. The same neighborhood that carried an enormous cultural force was carrying at the same time overcrowding, inflated rents, irregular work, and the old American habit of limiting opportunity with one hand while admiring resilience with the other. You could have a block full of gifted people and still have too many unpaid bills behind too many doors. You could have art everywhere and still have not enough coal, not enough sleep, and not enough certainty about next month. The Depression made all of this heavier. Work vanished unevenly, and in Harlem it seemed to vanish first and return last. Men who had dressed carefully for jobs they no longer had still folded their jackets at night, as if the next morning might restore a routine. Women stretched meals, and stretched patience, and stretched rent money until arithmetic itself began to feel cruel. Landlords still expected payment, grocers still kept accounts, children still outgrew shoes, hope remained, but it started to live closer to exhaustion. It is tempting, looking back, to imagine a clear dividing line, one era of music and one era of damage. But the truth was slower and less dramatic than that. Hardship did not announce a turning point with a single date. It seeped, it gathered, it made people tired in particular ways. It made illegal economies easier to tolerate, then easier to ignore, then easier to step around. A neighborhood already accustomed to improvising under pressure could become accustomed, too, to the presence of things it had not chosen, simply because there was too much else to manage before dinner, and before rent day, and before morning. When Prohibition ended, that did not mean the underground world disappeared. It only meant the underground had to become inventive again. Networks that had moved alcohol through the city did not retire out of civic gratitude. They looked for new merchandise, new margins, new weaknesses, new neighborhoods that could be entered not with fanfare but with familiarity. Roots already existed, corruptions already existed, men already knew whom to pay, where to store, whom to threaten, whom to charm. And somewhere inside that existing machinery, heroin began to find its place. It did not enter Harlem as a thunderclap. It came the way many lasting harms come, quietly, socially, through doors that had been opened for other reasons. Through people who did not look like invaders, through conversations that sounded almost casual, through claims of relief, confidence, softness, escape. Through the soft pressure of trying to continue in a world that had already become too hard around the edges. So before we go any farther, let the neighborhood settle one more time in your mind. The windows, the late train, the club awning catching damp light, the footsteps on Lenox, the tired worker climbing stairs, the room above the street where somebody is still practicing a phrase on a horn. The history we are entering does not begin in chaos. It begins in a place alive enough to be wounded deeply. And that is where the story has to continue. By the time the first whispers began to move through Harlem about the new drug, the neighborhood had already learned how to live with contradiction. There could be elegance on the avenue and unpaid rent upstairs. There could be music in the ballroom and silence in the icebox at home. There could be a community creating some of the most modern art in America, while still being denied some of the most ordinary securities of American life. The contradiction was not a flaw in Harlem, it was the condition imposed on it. That is why the first cracks mattered so much. A person does not need to be careless to become vulnerable. A community does not need to be weak to be targeted. It only has to be carrying too much. Harlem in the early and middle 1930s was carrying a great deal. Jobs had narrowed, wages came and went, apartments were overcrowded, often because there was nowhere else to go. Families who had come north expecting one kind of struggle found themselves negotiating another. They had escaped the old humiliations of one region only to meet the colder humiliations of another. Dressed differently, spoken more politely, enforced more bureaucratically. The texture of daily life began to change in small ways first. A man might spend an extra hour on the corner because he had no reason to hurry home to another evening of worry. A landlady who once tolerated late rent with patient sympathy might become sharper because her own mortgage had come due. A mother might count the same coins 3 times before sending a child to the store, as if precision itself could make the amount grow. A church deacon might know of 3 respectable men suddenly in need of help, and only enough charity in hand for one of them. None of this is dramatic in the cinematic sense, but it matters more than the dramatic scenes ever do. Real decline rarely begins with sirens. It begins with strain becoming ordinary. Harlem remained beautiful in the eyes of many outsiders because culture is visible and stress is often private. Visitors could hear the band and miss the unpaid electric bill. They could watch couples dance and never know how many of them would walk home calculating how to make Sunday's money last until Thursday. They could praise the genius of the neighborhood and never ask why genius had to survive on so little. This was the quiet vulnerability that criminal networks understood better than reformers did. A contained neighborhood, intensely connected, socially dense, economically pressured, and already accustomed to informal systems for getting by, could be read not as a community in need of support, but as a market. Not an abstract market either, a practical one. Streets that could be learned, faces that could be remembered, habits that could be predicted, needs that could be exploited. The end of prohibition mattered here not because it changed the moral weather of America overnight, but because it left an infrastructure looking for new use. Men who had smuggled, distributed, protected, and profited were not likely to step gracefully into legitimate obscurity. They had vehicles, contacts, corrupt arrangements, and the habit of operating in the dark space between legality and appetite. They understood something simple and dangerous. If one prohibited substance stopped yielding, another one could take its place. Heroin fit that logic too well. It was compact, profitable, and easily folded into hidden channels that already existed. It moved through cities not as an isolated novelty, but but as part of the same practical intelligence that had once moved liquor. Who can be trusted? Who can be bought? Who can be frightened? Which officers look away? Which buildings are useful? Which neighborhoods are policed heavily but protected lightly? Harlem, already burdened and already watched, became vulnerable not only because dealers could enter it, but because respectable society had so long neglected the conditions that made resistance harder. Even then, heroin did not immediately appear as a civic catastrophe. It emerged as rumor, as private habit, as something seen in glances rather than in official records. People noticed changes before they knew the cause. A musician seeming too distant in the hour before a set. A young man leaning in a doorway with a softness in his face that was not sleep. A woman whose confidence had turned, over weeks, into a strange kind of drift. Friends had language for many hardships. This one arrived before the neighborhood had a settled language for it. And that delay mattered. When people do not yet understand what they are looking at, they interpret danger through whatever meanings are already available. In Harlem, as in many places, one available meaning was fatigue. Another was nerves. Another was heartbreak. Another was the ordinary stress of trying to remain upright in a decade that had made uprightness expensive. What looked at first like a private coping habit did not immediately declare itself as a public threat. It could be mistaken for mood, for style, for creative temperament, for a temporary aid to endurance. By the time the pattern became clearer, it had already found social roots. That is one of the cruelest features of the story. The epidemic did not begin with strangers in alley shadows, though there were shadows enough. It began through familiarity, through rooms where people already trusted one another, through local knowledge, through the little everyday permissions by which one person is allowed to influence another. Harlem wrapped itself in ordinary relationships, and because the neighborhood had so often survived by leaning on its own people, that familiarity was powerful. Harlem had been built, in part, through closeness, through kin, church, music, rooming houses, mutual recommendations, informal jobs, introductions from one person to another. Those same channels that once carried hope and opportunity could also carry poison when enough pressure and enough profit entered the system. The structure of community itself became one of the routes through which danger traveled. Still, on many nights the neighborhood looked almost unchanged. The light on the avenue still glowed. A tune still rose from an open window. Someone still laughed on the stoop. Someone still hurried to make the last train. Someone still believed that tomorrow would widen. That is another reason history turns slowly. The appearance of continuity can continue long after the substance has begun to shift. And so the next part of the story does not begin with a police bulletin or a moral panic. It begins in the places where admiration and exhaustion live closest together, in the rooms where performance ends and private need begins, in the uncertain interval between talent and stability. It begins, in other words, where music is made, and where people who make it are often asked to give more feeling than life has paid them for. For musicians, Harlem could be both invitation and trial. From the outside, the life seemed electric. The club lights, the smoke, the late applause, the sense that something modern and important was happening in real time. But the working life beneath that glamour was precarious. A player might have a good week, and then 3 thin ones. A singer might be promised introductions, then forgotten by the people making them. A band could sound immortal at midnight, and still be haggling over the fee at 2 in the morning. There were always too many gifted people and too little security. That instability created a dangerous hunger for anything that seemed to smooth the edges. In such an atmosphere, heroin could be introduced not as ruin, but as assistance. It could be spoken of as calm, as confidence, as a way to settle the nerves before stepping on stage, as a way to feel a lyric more deeply, as a way to soften humiliation after another night of being admired by audiences and disrespected by owners. The claim did not need to be entirely persuasive to be effective. It only needed to reach people at the hour when they were most tired of holding themselves together. Some of the earliest local distributors understood the music world because they belonged to it. They made their influence more intimate and more persuasive. A stranger selling danger can be refused. A player you already admire, a person who knows the back entrance and the set list and your hopes for next month, is another matter. Advice sounds different when it comes from someone whose shoes you hope to stand beside. And in a scene built on recommendation and presence, social trust can become more powerful than caution. Imagine a young singer arriving in Harlem with one good dress, a boarding house room, and a voice people keep calling promising. Promising is a lovely word until it becomes your only income. She is introduced to a saxophone player who seems to know every club owner worth knowing. He is kind when she is anxious, attentive when others are distracted, charming without appearing to try. He tells her she tightens before the high phrases. He tells her she could relax into the room more. He tells her he knows something that takes the edge off. Not every story looked like this, but enough of them did. First use might seem almost disappointingly ordinary. No thunder, no cinematic collapse, just a feeling of warmth, release, perhaps a sense that fear has moved a little farther away from the body. On a stage, under low light, that can feel like revelation. A person who has been fighting their own nerves might mistake numbing for freedom. A performer who has been bracing against embarrassment might mistake detachment for control. A difficult world can make false relief feel profound. And then the arrangement changes. The thing that appeared to widen expression starts narrowing it. The confidence begins to require repeating. The relief begins to charge interest. A person discovers that what seemed optional now feels necessary before performance. Then after performance, then on an ordinary afternoon with no audience at all, life starts to reorganize itself around access, schedules, friendships, borrowed money, private lies, all begin to curve toward the same center. The mythology of artistic depth remains on the surface even as dependency takes hold beneath it. This mythology was powerful because it attached itself to something real enough to be tempting. Great art does often come from feeling. Great music does require surrender. Great performance does ask people to move past fear. When heroin was whispered about as a shortcut to soulfulness, it exploited truths about art while hiding truths about addiction. That is why the myth lasted. It was not absurd. It was adjacent to something sincere, and therefore easier to believe. There were young musicians who looked at admired elders and imagined that the drug was somehow part of the sound, part of the aura, part of the difference between merely competent and unforgettable. It is one of history's sadder habits that suffering, when attached to talent, gets mistaken for a method. But the more reliable truth was simpler. People who were overworked, underpaid, racially demeaned, and constantly expected to transform pain into beauty, were being offered a chemical truce with themselves. Some accepted it, many paid dearly, and the sadness did not remain in the clubs. A singer might begin to miss rehearsals. A trumpet player might borrow too often. A pianist, once known for humor, might become strangely still between sets. Someone who had always been generous becomes evasive. Someone who had always looked after the younger performers begins introducing them to habits he cannot control in himself. The scene shifts without announcing that it has shifted. Admiration remains, so does style, but something softer and more dangerous settles underneath. The tragedy is not only that artists suffered, it is that the community around them often had reasons to trust them. A neighborhood that had built pride around cultural brilliance could be slow to imagine that some of its most gifted and beloved figures were also carrying a new form of harm into the rooms where young ambition gathered. The trusted face became a root. The familiar laugh became a bridge. Beauty itself, for a while, helped conceal the problem. And yet, even here, we should move gently. The people at the center of this part of the story were not all schemers, not all predators, not all conscious agents of destruction. Many were themselves caught, half believing the stories they repeated, sharing what had once been offered to them as rescue. That does not lessen the harm, but it changes the tone in which the history ought to be told. This was not corruption in a simple theatrical sense. It was exhaustion, longing, vanity, pain, pressure, and opportunism, mixing together until the damage became difficult to separate from the charm. So let the club lights dim a little now. Let the last set end. Let the chairs be turned. let the floor be swept outside. The street is cooler. A singer is walking home with her collar raised, somewhere above the avenue, in a rented room. Someone is telling herself that tonight was only tonight, that this new dependence is temporary, that talent will carry her back to herself before anything worse can happen. But the story has already moved beyond the stage. One of the hardest things for any community to face is the moment when a problem stops belonging to a scene and starts belonging to a home. While heroin was still associated, however loosely, with nightlife, musicians, and the risky glamour of after-hours rooms, many Harlem families could imagine that the trouble was nearby without being intimate. That illusion did not survive for long. Drugs rarely remain where society first names them. They follow pathways more ordinary than headlines ever admit. They move through brothers-in-law and old school friends, through a man sleeping temporarily on a cousin's sofa, through borrowed money that is not returned, through concern that becomes suspicion and suspicion that becomes a scene nobody in the house knows how to survive gracefully. The epidemic in Harlem entered apartments not with a crash, but with repeated small permissions. Someone stays a few days. Someone needs help. Someone says the problem is only temporary. Someone believes them because the alternative is too painful to say aloud. In one household after another, a similar drama began to unfold in slightly different tones. A dependable working man notices that his wife's brother has become too vague about expenses. A mother realizes that the daughter who had once been lively now drifts in and out of conversation as though a curtain is moving between her and the room. Children learn that adults can be frightened and still pretend not to be. The family table, which ought to be a place of ordinary repetition, becomes a place where every silence feels loaded, and domestic spaces magnify suffering in a particular way. A club can hide decline in atmosphere. A street corner can hide it in motion, but a household must absorb it directly if someone disappears for hours. The household feels the absence. If wages are spent elsewhere, the household counts the missing money. If shame enters the rooms, it changes the sound of every conversation. Families are where addiction stops being abstract and starts breaking furniture. Sleep, trust, and the ordinary sequence of meals. There's a special kind of heartbreak in watching decent people try to solve a problem for which decency alone has no tools. Harlem had long traditions of mutual aid, church care, family obligation, and neighborhood intervention. People were used to stepping in when somebody was struggling. They could help a widow. They could help a sick neighbor. They could help a newcomer find a room or a little work. But heroin introduced a form of distress that did not yield easily to counsel, discipline, or short-term generosity. What looked at first like a manageable crisis kept returning in altered form. A man might lend money twice, then 5 times, then begin to understand that his help is financing the very thing he wishes to end. A sister might offer a room believing she is protecting her brother from the street, only to discover that the street can enter with him. A wife might insist on mercy because she remembers the person before the addiction, while her husband insists on limits because he is living with the person addiction has made. Neither is wrong. Both are exhausted. The household becomes a place of moral injury, where love and self-protection cannot be cleanly separated. Children, of course, understand more than adults hope, and less than adults fear. They notice the uncle who speaks too slowly. They notice the mother who cries with the door closed. They notice the argument interrupted when their feet appear in the hallway. They notice the money missing from a drawer, though they may not know why it matters. Many of them first met the epidemic not as a concept, but as confusion. Why is everyone tense? Why is the house suddenly divided into topics that may be spoken in daylight and topics that belong only to whispers after midnight? Once addiction enters a family system, time itself changes. Plans become provisional. Promises are weighed against previous promises. Hope becomes repetitive. Tomorrow will be the day he stops. Next week she will be herself again. After this one last help, things will settle. The household starts living not by the calendar but by episodes of crisis and brief periods of deceptive calm. This is one of the hidden burdens of an epidemic. It teaches people to mistrust ordinary. Peace because they no longer believe it will last. In Harlem, this domestic strain intersected with every existing pressure. Overcrowded apartments allowed very little privacy, which meant distress spread quickly through all members of the household. Too little money meant there was rarely a safe buffer between a family emergency and a financial emergency. Discrimination in housing and employment made it harder to remove oneself cleanly from trouble. Families could not simply relocate or absorb the cost of treatment or lost wages. They were already working too close to the edge, and still, in many homes, people tried to preserve ritual. Dinner was served, clothes were pressed, children were sent to school. Sunday shoes were polished. Even under pressure, families continued to perform normalcy because normalcy is one of the last forms of dignity available when control is slipping. That effort deserves to be remembered. Harlem did not stop being a community the moment heroin entered its homes. It labored to remain one. It set tables. It kept records. It prayed. It tried. But the trying took a toll, even under pressure. A neighborhood can still sound almost gentle from the outside. Plates are stacked. A window is lowered against the weather. Somebody hums while folding a shirt. The damage is already present, but it has not yet learned how to name itself aloud. By the time a problem reaches the home, the next stage is often not healing, but adaptation. People begin changing routes, changing routines, changing the terms on which they trust one another. A family that once welcomed a relative indefinitely now counts nights and measures risk. A mother who once sent a child freely to a nearby errand now watches from the window. A husband stops leaving cash where he used to leave it. A daughter stops inviting certain friends upstairs. The home becomes less open, less relaxed, more vigilant. In trying to survive the problem, the household itself becomes altered. And when enough households are altered in the same neighborhood, the street outside starts to change as well. What began in Harlem as something socially embedded and semi-hidden did not remain loose for very long. Informal selling gives way, in profitable markets, to organization. A person who shares casually with friends may be replaced by someone who thinks in terms of roots, personnel, risk, and territory. Once heroin proved that it could produce steady money in a neighborhood already under pressure, more disciplined forms of control followed. There is a tendency, in retrospect, to imagine these operations as chaotic by default. But much of the damage came from the opposite. They could be orderly, structured, patient. Men who saw the drug trade as business rather than improvisation brought with them a certain grim efficiency. Lookouts learned corners, runners learned stairwells, sellers learned patterns of patrol. Money moved in one direction, product in another, information in a third. Respectability, or the appearance of it, became useful camouflage. A local operation could begin to resemble a legitimate enterprise in all the ways that mattered, and in none of the ways that blessed a community. There were expectations, hierarchies, penalties, rewards, strategic decisions about where to stand and when to disappear. The people who managed such systems did not need philosophical justification. Profit was clarity enough, and in a place where legal work often offered little dignity and less money. The visible confidence of the drug economy could make itself felt even by those who despised it. The neighborhood learned its new street logic in stages. At first, it was only a slight shift in atmosphere, a few corners that felt different after dusk, a few faces always watching, a few local businesses under subtle pressure. Then the shift became more legible. Men loitered not as idlers, but as participants in a system. Transactions acquired rhythm. Certain hallways seemed to belong less to tenants than to traffic. The old social use of public space, conversation, flirting, gossip, children weaving through adults, began to compete with a colder kind of use built around surveillance and control. Shopkeepers were often among the first to understand how much had changed. A small grocer or luncheonette owner knows a neighborhood in the practical sense. Who buys on credit, who pays late but honestly, which kids run errands for grandparents, which men have too much time on a weekday afternoon, which women are carrying 2 jobs in their posture. When dealers sought to use local businesses as fronts, way stations or laundering points, they were not only hunting convenience. They were testing whether ordinary life could be made to serve the trade. Some owners refused out of principle. Others refused because they had already seen too much harm among customers they knew by name. But refusal in such an environment came with cost. First, there might be hovering, then intimidation disguised as friendliness, then broken glass, damaged stock, whispered threats, a sense that the back of the shop had become visible to men who should not know what was stored there. A proprietor who had spent years building trust in the neighborhood could find that trust no longer protected the door after dark. The worst part was not always the overt violence. It was the creeping adjustment of daily behavior. Doors locked earlier, shutters came down sooner. A woman who used to sweep the front step after dusk now did it before sundown. Customers stopped lingering over small purchases. Children were called inside faster. The evening economy of ordinary sociability began to thin. Harlem's streets had once been part of its cultural bloodstream, places of exchange far richer than commerce. Under the discipline of the drug trade, that public life narrowed. And yet, even here, the transformation was not total all at once. A block could still contain laughter and fear on the same evening. A churchgoer could pass a dealer and continue to choir rehearsal. A mother could buy potatoes while pretending not to notice the lookout across the way. That is the unnerving thing about social decline. It does not ask permission to coexist with normal life for a while. It layers itself beside it, then over it, then through it. For young people growing up in this altered landscape, the lesson was subtle and relentless. They saw who had cash. They saw who moved with confidence. They saw which adults were tired, which businesses were closing, which teachers were overworked, which promises about the future sounded noble but thin. Even teenagers with good instincts could not help absorbing the comparison. Lawful life was respectable, yes, but respectable life could also be cramped, exhausted, poorly paid, and perpetually deferred. The drug trade, by contrast, looked immediate. A street does not have to become silent to become less free. It only has to teach people to shorten conversations, to glance over shoulders, to decide that tonight is not the night to linger. That is how a neighborhood begins to feel itself changing from beneath, not only through harm already visible, but through the quiet education of the next generation in what power seems to look like. And so the story moves again, this time toward the boys on the edge of manhood, the students leaving school, the sons watching their mothers come home, too tired to eat before sleeping, the young people standing between instruction and necessity, trying to decide what kind of adulthood is available to them and how much danger a household can afford to call unacceptable. For teenagers in Harlem during these years, the future could appear as an argument between two kinds of realism. One kind said, stay in school, work hard, be patient, keep your name clean, and perhaps the world will eventually widen. The other said, the rent is due now, your mother is exhausted now, the groceries are thin now, and the men on the corner have money now. Adults often spoke as if the moral choice and the practical choice were naturally the same. But the neighborhood was teaching something harsher. A bright boy could sit in an overcrowded classroom with a broken window frame and hear a teacher describe distant opportunities while outside, a well-dressed courier earned more in an afternoon than his mother might earn in a week of punishing labor. This did not automatically make him criminal. It made him observant. It made him aware that respectability and survival were no longer arranged in a comforting sequence. Sometimes they stood in direct competition. Recruitment into the drug trade did not always begin with the word drugs. That would have been too blunt, too easy to refuse, too likely to trigger the moral teaching that even the most strained households still tried to preserve. Instead, it often began with tasks that could be named otherwise. Carry this package. Wait for that envelope. Walk here, then there. You are not selling. You are helping. You are reliable. You are useful. The wages are immediate. The explanations are vague on purpose. This vagueness mattered. It created a moral cushion. A teenager could tell himself he was only delivering something. He could tell his mother he was running errands for a businessman. He could accept money without having to say aloud what made the money possible. In neighborhoods where survival often required improvisation, that ambiguity was powerful. It allowed young people to cross into danger one practical step at a time, without feeling that they had made a single, dramatic leap. Imagine a 16-year-old standing outside school with his mind full of overdue rent and his mother's tired hands. He has watched the electric service flicker in and out. He has watched her accept humiliating extra work to keep food on the table. Then, an older boy, polished and relaxed, offers him $50 for a simple delivery. $50 is not abstract in such a life. It is heat. It is groceries. It is the difference between pleading and paying. The moral dimension of the offer does not vanish, but it becomes harder to hear over the sound of necessity. Once the first errand goes smoothly, the arrangement begins to feel almost rational. Nothing terrible happened. No violence, no arrest, no visible victim. Only money in hand and relief at home. That relief can be intoxicating even without the drug itself. To ease one's mother's worry, to bring dignity back into the kitchen, to hear the household breathing less anxiously for a week. That can make illicit work feel not only justified, but loving. This is one of the darkest truths in the Harlem story. The trade fed on virtues as well as vices: loyalty, protectiveness, family duty, the desire to help, the shame of being unable to contribute. Young people were not recruited only through appetite or swagger. Many were recruited through care. The very impulse to support a household became part of the machinery drawing them in. And households, in turn, often accepted the first signs of relief because relief is hard to interrogate when you desperately need it. A mother who had been losing sleep over the rent might not ask enough questions about a son's new money if the lights come back on and the pantry fills for the first time in weeks. She may suspect, then postpone suspicion, then insist on believing what she already knows is incomplete. Exhaustion encourages selective faith. The young courier becomes a regular courier. Then he waits for returns, then he carries money, then he is trusted with more. Each task is close enough to the last to feel like continuation rather than transformation. Before long, he is participating in a system he could not have named honestly at the beginning. The gradualness is everything. Abrupt corruption is easier to dramatize, but gradual entanglement is what actually remakes a life. As this happened across Harlem, the neighborhood's youth absorbed more than income patterns. They absorbed an education in fear, posture, and silence. They learned when not to look. They learned which names to avoid repeating indoors. They learned that an adult's respect might be sincere or tactical or temporary. They learned that money could arrive carrying obligations not visible to a younger sibling at the table. These are not lessons a community gives willingly, but once given, they spread. And still, much of the city beyond Harlem preferred explanations that were easier to repeat than to examine. Bad company, weak character, a generation going wrong. Such phrases had a clean sound to them. And clean sounds can be very comforting to societies that do not wish to look closely. But Harlem was not producing these young lives in a vacuum. The drug trade had not stepped into a field full of fair and patient opportunities. It had stepped into absence, into narrowed work, narrowed schooling, narrowed expectation, and into the old American habit of calling neglect a personal failure once the neglect had done its work. So when arrests came, they often fell first and hardest on the most visible and least protected. A boy carrying for somebody higher up, a young man on a corner who did not own the corner, did not control the price, did not design the route, and yet could still receive the full social weight of disgrace. Meanwhile, the quieter men, the financiers, the brokers, the protectors, the ones who turned dirty money into respectable paper, remained harder to see and therefore easier to leave intact. The neighborhood watched its children acquire records before they had acquired much else. So let us slow the breath again. Picture a mother in a dim apartment, sitting at the edge of a bed after finding a hidden roll of bills where no honest part-time job could have placed it. Picture the silence before she speaks. Picture the son calculating whether confession will save him or endanger them both. Picture love having to ask questions it cannot bear to know the answer to. The epidemic was never only on the corner, it was also in this room, in this pause, in the space between necessity and shame. And from these rooms, the story moves toward the institutions that claim to answer the crisis, though most did not yet understand what sort of crisis they were facing. Police officers in Harlem were not arriving as neutral readers of a new emergency. They came with habits of perception already formed by training, by culture, by institution. They knew how to count complaints, seize packets, line men against walls, and write reports that translated public disorder into official language. But heroin was not only producing incidents, it was producing repetition, exhaustion, and return. A person could be arrested and then returned, almost unchanged, to the same room, the same pressure, the same dependency, the same impossible arithmetic waiting at home. Even then, ordinary life kept trying to hold its shape. Someone still rose early for work. Someone still brushed lint from a jacket before church. Someone still turned a key in a door and hoped the night would remain ordinary. That desire for ordinariness matters, because it is what history so often asks communities to protect while larger systems fail them. For some officers, this created a weary kind of frustration. The same users reappeared. The same young men moved from custody back to corners, and from corners back to custody. The same families never seemed to leave crisis for long enough to call it stability. A conventional law and order mind expects punishment to interrupt behavior in a neat, visible line. Addiction and economic desperation do not move in neat, visible lines. They circle. They repeat. They wear grooves in ordinary life. An officer with enough honesty might notice, after a while, that the people easiest to arrest were not necessarily the people most central to the epidemic. Street sellers were visible. Users pawning household objects were visible. The frightened teenager moving one package from one building to another was visible. The men farther up the ladder, and the men then laundering profit through safer rooms, were much less so. Visibility, however, has always had a way of disguising itself as importance, and so enforcement often settled on what could be reached, rather than on what most needed to be understood. In Harlem, that punitive logic was sharpened by race and class. When addiction settled in poor Black and Latino neighborhoods, it became easier for wider society to speak the language of vice where it might have used the language of illness elsewhere. Hardship was moralized, dependency was criminalized, treatment sounded indulgent, punishment sounded serious, sympathy, which can be very expansive in the abstract, grew narrower when suffering wore the face of urban poverty. This did not mean that every officer lacked feeling, or that every resident wanted the police kept away. Reality was more tangled than slogans. Many families genuinely wanted protection from dealers. Many residents were exhausted by fear and would have welcomed any response that truly restored ordinary safety. Some officers meant well, but good intentions and good methods are not the same thing. In a delicate civic emergency, blunt tools tend to break what they claim to save. Raids could be dramatic in all the ways cities know how to stage drama. Doors forced open, men turned toward walls, tables covered with evidence for photographers, headlines that made action look almost identical to solution. Yet the neighborhood itself often felt something quieter and sadder. Dealers were replaced, users returned, fear adjusted its route. Families learned that a crackdown heavily described in newspapers could still leave a hallway just as tense at night as it had been before. Worse, aggressive enforcement often widened the distance between institutions and the residents those institutions claimed to defend. Innocent people were swept up, apartments were searched roughly. Older residents who had spent years trying to hold on to respectability found themselves treated as suspicious because they lived in the wrong building, or knew the wrong nephew, or answered the wrong knock. Humiliation entered the story alongside fear, and once humiliation settles in, cooperation grows thin very quickly. That mistrust lingered far beyond any one operation. People stopped saying what they knew. Witnesses looked away. Parents taught children to avoid not only certain corners, but certain conversations. certain uniforms, certain forms of visibility altogether. The neighborhood civic pulse slowed. Trust is one of the first things an epidemic can take once it becomes entangled with public spectacle. And Harlem felt that loss with a particular heaviness. So before the story moves on, let the block quiet itself for a moment. A hallway light humming, a radio turned low behind one door. Somebody rinsing cups in a small kitchen, somebody else waiting for footsteps on the stairs and hoping they belong to nobody urgent. History, even here, is still taking place in rooms like these. By the early 1940s, parts of Harlem were living under a new kind of tension. One less about the hidden spread of dependency and more about visible intimidation, territorial pressure, and the unpredictability of violence. Once multiple organized groups recognized the profits available, the neighborhood ceased to be merely a market. It became disputed ground, and disputed ground changes the behavior of everyone who must cross it. The violence did not remain neatly contained among participants. That is one of the first fantasies to fail in any criminal economy. Adults may tell themselves that danger belongs only to those who choose it. But bullets do not sort the innocent from the involved. A seamstress walking home from work, a child leaving school, a widow locking her shop, all can become part of the cost when profit is defended by fear. Harlem learned this not in one instant, but in a series of evenings that made the next evening feel less certain. A shooting near a restaurant, a confrontation near a school, threats passed through a relative who supposedly knows where somebody sleeps. These events do more than injure bodies. They instruct the whole neighborhood in caution. Parents begin selecting routes, the way soldiers choose cover. Teachers delay dismissal and watch the street before letting children go. Shopkeepers weigh one more hour of business against one more hour of risk. Public life shrinks not because community vanishes, but because caution becomes rational. Children carried perhaps the strangest burden. They were asked to continue being children in a geography increasingly arranged around adult danger. A boy might still run down the school steps with his satchel swinging, but now he also knew which block not to cross. A girl might still recite a lesson in class and then walk home practicing, without quite knowing it, the posture of not meeting certain eyes. Knowledge like that enters the body early, it seldom leaves quickly. Trauma in a neighborhood does not always announce itself as weeping. Often it appears as watchfulness, sleeplessness, a shortened temper, sudden silence, a child who flinches at a slammed door, another who draws guns before he learns to draw trees, another who becomes too protective of a younger sibling because safety has started to feel like a private duty. These are quiet transformations, but they shape the next generation as surely as hunger shapes the present one. By now, Harlem had become a place where even uninvolved families felt the need to negotiate the trade indirectly. A grandmother answering the door might wonder whether the men asking questions are merely rude or genuinely dangerous. A mother crossing an avenue with her daughter might register that somebody is watching longer than politeness allows. The ordinary confidence by which people once moved through familiar streets began to fray. Home no longer ended risk. It only changed its shape, and still the city often preferred the language of emergency without adopting the kind of understanding emergency required. Harlem needed safety, certainly, but it also needed interpretation. It needed somebody to say, plainly and without condescension, that addiction was not simply wickedness, and that fear was not proof of communal failure. It needed language more humane than raid reports, and more useful than moral alarm. That is why the appearance of even a fragile treatment-based perspective mattered so much. So let the breath slow once more. Think of a church basement after most people have gone home. Folded chairs, a coffee urn cooling, one tired bulb overhead. A voice speaking more softly than the crisis has earned, and precisely because of that softness becoming useful at last. In the middle of a story crowded with force, there were also people who looked at Harlem and saw not a moral spectacle, but a community carrying an injury. Among doctors, social workers, clergy, and a few unusually perceptive civic figures, another reading slowly emerged. Heroin dependency was not only a crime problem, it was also a bodily problem, a psychological problem, a family problem, a problem of unequal pressure distributed across a neighborhood already asked to endure too much. This can sound ordinary to modern ears, because later generations became used to hearing addiction described in therapeutic terms, even when politics continued to lag behind. But at the time, such a view required imagination. To say that people needed treatment rather than simple punishment was not to excuse the damage. It was to insist that causes mattered. It was to refuse the comforting fiction that enough arrests of low-level offenders would somehow add up to healing. A physician who became dependent on heroin could be especially clarifying in this regard. Respectability had long served as a false shield in public imagination. Many people preferred to believe that addiction belonged to the disordered, the weak, the already fallen. But when a doctor, educated, disciplined, apparently settled, could also be pulled into dependency under pressure, the myth cracked. Heroin had no interest in preserving social vanity. Stress, access, secrecy, and repeated relief could bend any life. Treatment efforts in Harlem were often modest, improvised, underfunded, and fragile. A storefront, a church basement, a borrowed room, a chair pulled out for somebody who had not been listened to seriously in months. Yet the fragility of these efforts should not obscure their significance. They represented one of the earliest attempts to meet the epidemic where it actually lived. In body, in mind, in family, and in circumstance all at once. A mother seeking help for her son needed more than a sermon. She needed advice on how to keep him safe while withdrawing from dangerous work. She needed practical support, perhaps a path toward ordinary employment, perhaps temporary relief, perhaps simply a room where she could say aloud that she was frightened and tired without being treated as guilty by association. Treatment, in that wider sense, was never only about the user. It was about the web of people around the user and the pressures that had made the habit seem useful in the first place. For the young men trying to leave the trade, escape was rarely a matter of sudden purity. It required logistics, quiet negotiation, time, sometimes luck. If you had cared for the wrong people and knew too much, simply walking away could look suspicious. Yet even within those constraints, some did find paths outward. The possibility of recovery did not repair Harlem, but it changed the emotional weather of the story. It proved that dependency was not destiny, and that the neighborhood's future did not belong only to dealers, judges, or police. These moments of hope must be handled gently. False uplift is one of the quickest ways to break the spell of sleep history. The truth was softer and sadder. Recovery existed, but at a scale far smaller than the need. A candle in a dark hallway is real light. It is also not the same thing as morning. Harlem had candles. Morning was still some distance away. And so the story widens again. Around the neighborhood moved larger systems, federal investigators, local officials, bankers willing to look away for a fee, organized groups whose interests stretched beyond any one block. Follow the cash, and the shape of the epidemic changes. The young seller on the corner begins to look less like the center of the story, and more like the most visible leaf of a root system buried far below him. When major raids finally came, they arrived with the theatrical certainty authorities prefer. Simultaneous arrests, seized cash, stacks of records, names in newspapers. Officials standing before confiscated evidence as though packets arranged on a table could substitute for a solved human problem. For a moment, to distant observers, it may have felt as though the city had at last done something decisive. But neighborhoods know better than headlines how incomplete such victories can be. And yet, on many blocks, the night after the headlines looked much like the night before them. A radio low in a back room. A mother waiting. A dealer replaced. A child told not to linger outside. Public victory can be very loud. Neighborhood reality is often much quieter. And because disappointment has its own rhythm, Harlem adjusted to that too. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the quiet efficiency of people who have learned not to spend too much hope on announcements. Within weeks, sometimes days, the practical reality returned. Demand had not vanished, poverty had not vanished, trauma had not vanished. New faces appeared where old ones had been removed. Slightly different methods, slightly different alliances, the same underlying market. A crackdown can interrupt distribution for a while. It cannot erase the conditions that make distribution profitable or dependency appealing. Harlem lived this truth long before it became a familiar criticism of national drug policy. There is a special weariness that settles over a community after a loudly announced solution fails to solve. Hope becomes more cautious. Cynicism becomes easier. Residents who had tolerated hardship because they believed somebody somewhere might yet understand the depth of the problem began to suspect that understanding itself was in short supply. Officials could count arrests. Harlem was counting funerals, evictions, frightened children, shuttered shops, empty pews, and apartments where the old sociability had gone quiet. The economic drain of addiction was by then impossible to miss. Money that once moved through neighborhood businesses now disappeared into drugs. Restaurants lost regulars, tailors lost customers, landlords faced non-payment, then empty rooms, then the instability that comes when too many households are breaking at once. Churches saw reduced giving not because faith had disappeared, but because so much household money had been captured by desperation. The epidemic did not only injure bodies, it consumed circulation. It took the neighborhood's already limited resources and redirected them toward private ruin. This is why the old image of Harlem as purely a site of cultural brilliance or purely a site of social collapse is inadequate. It was both memory and wound, artistry and attrition, tenderness and fear, often on the same block. A nurse coming home from Harlem Hospital might pass a club still lit, a shuttered restaurant that had once been full, a mother pulling a child along faster than necessary, and a man leaning in a doorway with the distant softness of dependence in his face. The neighborhood's rhythm had not ended. It had changed key. Children growing up in this changed key carried it into adulthood. Some were scarred in ways they would not fully name for years. Some became unusually watchful, unusually guarded, unusually convinced that danger could appear in any ordinary afternoon. Others turned their childhood knowledge into activism, medicine, music, ministry, social work. Communities often preserve themselves partly through the people who survive them with memory intact. Harlem did that too. Even amid damage, it produced witnesses. And witnesses matter because the epidemic in Harlem became more than a local story. It became a kind of template, not identical in every later city, not mechanically repeated, but hauntingly similar in pattern. Concentrated hardship, criminal opportunity, a drug promising relief, youths recruited through need, families absorbing the shock, institutions reaching first for punishment, treatment arriving too slowly, public declarations of victory followed by stubborn continuation. Later, America would act surprised by versions of this pattern more than once. Harlem had already lived it. That is part of the reason to tell the story gently. A harsh telling can make the past feel remote, like a cautionary exhibit behind glass. A gentle telling keeps the human scale intact. It reminds us that neighborhoods do not collapse as abstractions. They change through ordinary rooms, ordinary wages, ordinary longing, ordinary fear. A city becomes historical not only through famous names, but through unnamed evenings when a family decides whether to let someone stay another week, whether to answer a knock at the door, whether to believe a son one more time. So now, as we come toward the far edge of the night, let Harlem return not as a solved case, but as a place still breathing in memory. The avenue is quieter than before. Some windows are dark. Some still hold lamplight. Somewhere music remains, though perhaps farther away than it once felt. Somewhere, a mother has finally slept after too many nights waiting on footsteps in the hall. Somewhere a child is learning, without yet knowing the phrase for it. That grown-up fear can live inside wallpaper and floorboards, and still leave a room standing. The story does not close cleanly because history almost never does. Even recovery, where it came unevenly. Some people found treatment. Some found faith. Some found work. Some found distance. Some were buried. Some were jailed. Some simply endured long enough for the neighborhood to change around them again. The brighter chapters of Harlem's future would come, but not as an erasure of this period. They would come carrying it, if you listen closely. That may be the last reveal the story offers. The crisis did not only damage Harlem, it taught America lessons America would be slow to learn. About addiction, about race, about punishment, about how often the nation prefers spectacle to care, about how much easier it is to condemn the visible poor than to dismantle the structures that make despair profitable. Harlem paid dearly to learn those things first, but tonight, rather than sealing the story shut, let us leave it where neighborhoods really live, in continuance. In windows, in names half remembered, in children grown old enough to tell what they saw, in hospital corridors, in church basements, in the tired grace of people who kept making meals, pressing clothes and humming songs in a place that had given them both beauty and grief. The deeper lesson was not that Harlem had been uniquely broken. It was that Harlem had been made to carry a combination of burdens that many other places would later be made to carry too. That is why the story lingers, not because it is sealed in the past, but because it keeps recognizing the future. So imagine the block one last time, a little mist in the air, a distant train, the fading pulse of brass from somewhere you cannot quite place. A brownstone stoop cooling after the day's heat, the feeling that history is not gone, only quieter now, resting in the brick and the pavement and the long memory of the city. And let the music, however faint, remain. Morning in the altered Harlem of the mid-40s had a different texture from the Harlem of only a decade before. Parents still woke children, still buttoned coats, still tied ribbons, still sent sons and daughters down stairwells towards school with final instructions called after them. But instructions now contained strategy. Stay on the avenue. Do not take the shortcut. Come straight back if you hear shouting. Go inside the nearest store. If a car stops and you do not know the people in it, keep walking. The language of ordinary childcare had absorbed the grammar of danger. This change in language tells us something important. A community does not need to be in open collapse to be profoundly injured. It only needs to force its children to become tacticians too early. Harlem's children were learning how to read corners before they were old enough to understand the economies operating on those corners. They learned the difference between a crowd gathered in pleasure and a crowd gathered in tension. They learned that some doorways were only doorways in daylight. They learned that adults sometimes smiled without relaxing. Teachers were among the keepers of this new unofficial knowledge. They could not cure the neighborhood's fear, but they could make small, practical adjustments. A class might be dismissed a few minutes earlier on one day, a few minutes later on another, depending on what had been heard from parents that morning. Children might be kept inside if there had been trouble nearby. A lesson would continue while every adult in the room remained aware of the windows. The formal curriculum still belonged to arithmetic, reading, penmanship, the history of the Republic. But the informal curriculum, the one students absorbed through atmosphere, concerned survival, caution, and the strange art of pretending not to notice what everybody noticed. Hospitals too became unwilling archives of the epidemic. Nurses and orderlies saw the neighborhood in condensed form, not by block or family or church affiliation, but by the injuries it brought through swinging doors. One week, there might be a series of overdoses. Another week, gunshot wounds, then infections, then withdrawal, then children whose neglect had become medical fact. Hospital workers learned to recognize not only symptoms, but patterns. This woman has the look of someone who has not slept because her brother is missing. That boy has the stare of a child who heard shots too near and is still listening for the echo. That man is trying very hard to act composed because dignity is the last thing he believes can be managed. If you stood quietly in an emergency ward long enough, you could almost read the neighborhood's private history in the bodies arriving there. The worker who pushed too far because there was no substitute for his wages. The addict whose family had hidden the habit from neighbors until there was no hiding left. The mother in tears because her son's arrest had solved nothing and made everything more public. The child who cannot explain why he cannot sleep. None of these stories looked like policy on arrival. Yet together, they formed the truest argument about policy anyone could have wanted. What Harlem endured in these years was not only a narcotics problem, and not only a crime problem, and not only a poverty problem. It was a problem of exhausted systems converging in the same place. Housing strain, job scarcity, racial exclusion, underfunded schools, unequal medical access, predatory illegal networks, blunt policing, public fascination with spectacle, private exhaustion in the home. Each alone was serious. Together they created a climate in which heroin could root itself more deeply than it might have in a neighborhood granted greater protection. The drug mattered, but so did the soil in which it landed. This is where later generations often rush too quickly toward abstraction. They say conditions, structures, systems, and the words are not wrong. But the danger of such language is that it can float above feeling. Harlem did not experience structure as an academic category. It experienced it as the landlord who would not wait, the factory that cut shifts, the school with too many students and too few teachers, the hospital with too little room, the police action that frightened the innocent, the employer who admired discipline but not enough to pay for it. Structure arrived as 100 practical limitations on what people could choose without risking hunger, shame, or danger. And because the choices were constrained, the moral landscape became more difficult than outsiders preferred to imagine. It is easy for distant observers to condemn a neighborhood for what it tolerates when they have never had to decide which danger gets priority on a given day. Do you confront the cousin bringing instability into the household if that confrontation might leave him sleeping in a hallway where he is even less safe? Do you call the police on the corner dealers if your building has just been searched roughly by men who seem to treat every resident as suspect? Do you insist your son refuse illegal work when lawful work will not keep the lights on? None of these questions have noble answers available on demand. They have only costly answers. The longer the epidemic continued, the more Harlem's social memory became layered. Older residents remembered a neighborhood of aspiration and emerging brilliance. Younger residents were learning a neighborhood of caution and hard bargains. These memories coexisted uneasily. Parents told stories of ballrooms, writers, crowded but joyful apartments, musicians practicing long into the night, and children listened with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, because the Harlem described by their elders did not fully match the one they saw from their own windows. The generational conversation itself became part of the tragedy, not because the older people were wrong, but because they had to sound nostalgic in order to sound truthful. Yet nostalgia was not the whole story either. Harlem did continue to generate culture even under pressure. This matters. Human beings do not suspend song, style, tenderness, or wit simply because danger has moved in. A pianist still played, a choir still rose, a young woman still ironed a collar carefully before going out, because appearance can be a form of resistance against humiliation. Men still argued about politics, baseball, and the future. Lovers still met, children still played when permitted. To remember this is not to soften the harm. It is to understand that community life does not vanish cleanly. It survives in fragments, and those fragments are often what allow recovery to begin later. Recovery itself, when it came, was almost never dramatic enough for newspapers. It looked more like substitution of rhythms. One woman attended treatment for months, relapsed, returned, relapsed again, returned again, and eventually began measuring life, not by collapse but by weeks of steadiness. One boy left the corner business and found work so dull he almost laughed at it. Yet the boredom became a kind of blessing because boredom meant safety. One mother learned to sleep through the night again only after years of waking at every stair sound. One building slowly repopulated with quieter tenants. One church basement became a place where people no longer came only to confess trouble, but to plan practical help. The argument between punishment and care would echo through later decades, but in Harlem, it was never abstract. It lived in actual rooms, in actual bodies, in mothers trying to decide whom to trust, and in young men trying to imagine a future longer than the week ahead. These are humble victories, but humble victories are the grammar of real communal repair. There is no single moment in which a neighborhood wakes and discovers that the epidemic has ended. and its former self has returned untouched. Instead, there are substitutions: a pawnshop visit not made, a debt not incurred, a child kept in school one more term, a supper eaten without accusation, a week in which the rent is paid from lawful work, though scarcely, a small business surviving the season, a person who once moved like a shadow beginning, almost imperceptibly, to move like a citizen again. Dr. Williams and others like her understood this in practice, even if the wider policy world did not. To treat addiction honestly, one had to treat time differently. Punishment loves clear events: arrest, sentence, seizure, raid. Healing prefers duration: weeks of trust, months of supervision, repeated conversations, temporary setbacks that do not erase the value of progress. In this sense, the treatment-oriented response was always at a disadvantage politically. It was harder to photograph, harder to announce, harder to turn into a triumphant headline. But for the people actually living inside the epidemic, it often came closer to reality than any press conference did. The conflict between these approaches would echo far beyond Harlem. In later decades, city after city would replay some version of the same debate. Are drugs primarily a matter of crime or public health? Are users to be feared, pitied, punished, or treated? Are neighborhoods in crisis best served by occupation, investment, or both? Harlem did not settle these questions. It exposed them. It revealed how much American society preferred simplified answers whenever the suffering population was poor, urban, and not wide enough to attract full national tenderness. This, too, became part of Harlem's legacy, not only the pain it endured, but the clarity with which it demonstrated the moral selectivity of public concern. The nation could admire black culture with enthusiasm, and still hesitate to extend black neighborhoods the forms of care, the genuine protection required. It could celebrate jazz and recoil from the conditions under which many musicians actually lived. It could consume style while ignoring overcrowding, consume entertainment while ignoring despair. This split between admiration and obligation was not incidental. It was one of the conditions that let the epidemic deepen. If we return for a moment to the image of the street at night, we can feel how history settled into daily habit. A block where people once lingered now empties earlier. A mother checks the hallway before sending a child to carry out trash. A young man with talent in his hands and worry in his chest decides whether to go to rehearsal or to the corner where easier money waits. An old woman who once knew every family by voice now keeps her conversations brief because she no longer trusts the stairwell. A patrol car passes. Faces turn away not because no one wants safety, but because safety has become difficult to distinguish from theater. Even city sound changed in memory. The famous Harlem is all brass and applause and brilliant human noise. In the years of the epidemic, another register moved underneath. Arguments cut short, doors locked faster, footsteps hesitating, distant sirens, the after silence following something everyone heard, but nobody on the block wishes to discuss with a stranger. Urban sound is an emotional archive. Harlem's archive in these years held both celebration and strain, often layered so closely that one could almost mask the other. Perhaps that is why the story remains so instructive. Drug crises are often described as if they descend upon communities from outside, like weather fronts without history. Harlem suggests something more troubling and more useful. A crisis may enter from outside, yes, but it flourishes according to local injury. It thrives where institutions are already thin, where trust has already been taxed, where legal opportunity feels abstract, where private exhaustion makes risky relief persuasive, where punishment can be loudly displayed while care remains underfunded and politically fragile. In that sense, the epidemic was not only imposed on Harlem, it was also enabled by everything Harlem had long been forced to endure. That is not blame, it is diagnosis. And diagnosis matters because the same refusal to diagnose honestly would haunt later responses elsewhere. By the time heroin spread through other cities, much of the essential pattern had already been lived in Harlem. Glamorized entry in some circles, practical recruitment in others, escalating violence where profits concentrated, public alarm followed by punitive policy. and a long, uneven recognition that dependency could not be arrested out of existence. Each later city added its own texture, but the outline was there. The musicians carried part of the pattern through networks of travel, gossip, and imitation. A player leaving New York for another scene did not leave behind every habit learned in New York. The myth of the drug as artistic deepener, false and stubborn, could move with the people who believed it. So could the practical knowledge of dealing, of sourcing, of street rhythm, of who might be susceptible and why. Harlem's crisis thus exceeded geography. It became instructional in the darkest possible sense. Yet even here, the neighborhood retained something that pure decline narratives failed to see. It retained witnesses with memory and language. Some were medical, some were maternal, some were pastoral, some were artistic, some were simply people who had seen enough to refuse cheap explanations thereafter. Communities survive partly because enough people remain capable of saying, quietly and accurately, what really happened. Not the headlines, not the official optimism, not the distant moralizing. What really happened in rooms, on staircases, in schools, at corners, in treatment lines, in kitchens after midnight. Perhaps sleep history can do one small thing that public policy often fails to do. It can stay with the human scale long enough for meaning to return. And what really happened was this: a neighborhood of uncommon cultural vitality, already pressured by inequality, was entered and reshaped by a drug economy that converted exhaustion into profit. Families tried to resist with the tools they had, and often those tools were not enough. Institutions responded visibly but incompletely. Some healers understood more than policymakers. Young people paid too much for other people's gain. Children learned fear too soon. Recovery, where it came humbly. Memory carried the rest. There is no clean moral at the end of such a history, only clear seeing. A community can be brilliant and vulnerable at once. Beauty does not immunize against predation. Talent does not protect against dependency. Policing can be active and still inadequate. Treatment can be humane and still too small. Public admiration can coexist with public neglect. These truths are not peculiar to Harlem, though Harlem bore them with unusual intensity. So now, as the hour grows later, the wisest ending is not a conclusion, but a return. Not to innocence, because history does not grant it back, but to atmosphere, to the feel of the place, to the block at night, to the city holding all its contradictions in brick and shadow. Picture a nurse coming home under weak streetlight, tired but not defeated. Picture a church basement folding chairs after a support meeting, the room smelling faintly of coffee and damp coats. Picture a teacher setting down papers at her kitchen table and staring for a moment into the window before beginning tomorrow's lesson plan. Picture an aging musician pausing halfway up the stoop because a phrase from long ago has come back to him, not as glamour now, but as memory. Picture a boy once recruited for deliveries, older now, heading home from lawful work so tired he almost laughs at the plainness of it, and grateful for that plainness all the same. These are not grand scenes. They are better than grand scenes. They are what remain when spectacle has failed, and life has to continue anyway. Harlem did continue. Changed, yes. Wounded, yes. Mistrustful in places. Haunted in others, but still inhabited by people making breakfasts, washing collars, paying what they could, burying their dead, raising children, singing in church, sweeping steps, flirting on warm evenings, remembering old brilliance, and trying, in ways large and small, to make the neighborhood lovable for one more season. History owes them more than a summary. It owes them the patience to be seen at that scale. And perhaps that is the final softness of the story. Even at the center of a drug epidemic, what most people wanted was terribly ordinary. A room that felt safe, work that paid enough, children who could walk home without calculation, a body not ruled by craving, an evening not interrupted by fear, a street where conversation could once again last longer than caution. Ordinary desires, quietly heroic in a century that kept making them difficult. So we do not close the door sharply on Harlem tonight. We leave it slightly open, enough for the distant music to come through, enough for memory to keep moving, enough to understand that the neighborhood was never only the wound, and never only the legend, but a living place in which both were carried at once. Outside, somewhere beyond the last sentence, a city is still settling itself for the night. If you have drifted somewhere between the avenue and the hospital corridor, between the ballroom and the boarding house, between the old brilliance and the later silence, then let that be enough. Let the city settle around you. Let the windows dim one by one. Let the footsteps thin. Let the worries that belonged to those years remain there, in their own time, while the human voices endure a little longer. Harlem does not ask to be judged from a distance tonight, only remembered closely, and in that closeness, even now, there is a kind of mercy.